Good evening, and welcome to a series of critical conversations that we are having with Scroll, Pi, and Survivors Against TB. My name is Chapal Mehra. I'm a public health specialist and a writer. And today we are going to be discussing public health science in times of COVID. Uh, the world has encountered a crisis in the form of the COVID-19 virus, which is unprecedented. And at this time, the role of public health and science has never been more critical. It is to science that we are looking for everything from the possibility of a COVID-19 vaccine to low-cost innovations and even a possible cure. And our understanding and our scientific capacity is critical to battling this crisis. How do we understand the nuances and the science around this pandemic has become particularly critical. Also because there is so much misinformation, or rather lack of information, on the key scientific factors that drive this epidemic. So to understand many of these issues and to discuss them, today I'm joined by one of the country's leading scientific minds, who is also a professor at CMC Vellore, Dr. Gagandeep Kang. We will be talking to her about understanding the role of science and public health in this pandemic. Good evening, Dr. Kang. Thank you so much for joining us.
Very pleased to be here, Chapal.
Let me ask a much kind of broad question here. The world has kind of encountered a virus which we were clearly not prepared for. The WHO has called it a pandemic that may last for 2 to 4 years. What do we know about the science of the virus? Because there is so much panic and anxiety around what it means, how it's being spread. There are so many theories. If you could, from a purely scientific point of view, explain this crisis to us.
If we look at the emergence of new viruses, this is not unexpected. It happens all the time. Whenever you look at animals and humans or different species of animals and birds being in contact with one another, there are pretty reasonable chances that a virus will cross species, jump from one species to another. The problem really arises when not only do you cross the species barrier, but also you gain the ability to transmit within the new species, which is spread within the new species. Now, this happens all the time. It may be your domestic dog or cat or cattle. You will be transmitting viruses to them. They will be transmitting viruses to you, but most often those viruses die out. Occasionally, you get a virus that crosses the barrier and starts to spread. This is not a rare event. If we look from the 1970s to now, it happens repeatedly every year. So look at AIDS. That's actually a zoonotic virus. Look at Zika, that's a zoonotic virus. Look at H1N1 that came in 2009. That was a zoonotic virus. So is MERS, so was the first SARS, so was Ebola. So if we look at SARS-CoV-2 being amongst us now, this is not something that was unexpected. The scale of it perhaps is something that we did not anticipate. In fact, when scientists sit around a table and think about where is the next pandemic coming from, what's usually on top of everybody's minds is a new influenza, and that's the scary one, something that transmits very easily and causes high mortality. In some sense, instead of panic and anxiety, actually, we've been pretty lucky, and we should recognize that this is a hugely transmissible virus. It made that jump, but it is not a virus that has a very high mortality rate. It's estimated that it's somewhere between 1 and 2%, perhaps even less than that. When you get infected, your chances of dying are very dependent on it. So while it is scary in the sense of the numbers, It's actually not scary at the scale of the infections that we are seeing. And as we move forward, I think these are aspects of the virus that it's very important for us to understand. The other thing is there will be another one like this.
I mean, that's a sobering thought to work with.
Name a location. Which location are you looking for?
I'm sorry, that seems to be an accidental voice. Let me just say that is the sobering thought in a sense, because you're saying there will be another one. People are talking of new waves of the virus, because the WHO is already, like I said earlier, talking to us about 2 to 4 years. Now, another broad question that I want to ask is, how should...
I need some more information.
Sorry,
What location are you looking for?
that's my phone.
That's all right. We'll hold for a second.
My
So
apologies, I haven't figured out how to shut off automatic assistance.
you and me both. So I just wanted to ask you this: how should countries prepare themselves? How do people prepare themselves with regard to this?
I think it's not about countries preparing themselves, it's really about the world preparing itself. Because if we look at the way viruses spread now, we are not safe until everybody is safe. We are not prepared until everybody is prepared. These viruses spread very easily. We have air travel now, which means you can get from any major city in the world to any other major city in 24 hours or less. So given that this virus has shown us what happens when you can have asymptomatic infections with the virus, that means that no amount of screening or checks at airports are going to tell you who is carrying the virus and who is not. All you can say is these are people coming from a place that has a high level of circulation of the virus. So, in terms of preparedness, what can we do? We need surveillance. We've never invested in surveillance the way we need to. Take a look at influenza. We know every year that we are going to have influenza in the monsoons and in the winters. The amount of surveillance that is done for influenza in India is very limited, done by a few agencies in a few locations. So when that is for something that you know is going to carry a very high burden, where are the systems for detecting something that you don't already know about? So we are lucky in that science now gives us the tools to be able to very quickly identify pathogens that we have no experience with. The ability to do sequencing quickly and at scale can help us identify those new agents, but we need for that to be distributed, and we need for an approach to be able to apply that level of genetic sequencing to everything that we can predict will be a threat. So people who live in forests, certain kinds of animal species like bats, doing some amount of surveillance in birds, doing some amount of surveillance in domestic animals, all of this in addition to screening humans, especially when you see clustering of cases, people who have similar clinical features coming into a facility at a time when you don't expect it. It's not rocket science, but it does require joined up thinking and investment.
Thank you for pointing us into that direction, because I think we often forget that some of the more fundamental investments in preparedness can actually mitigate some of the circumstances that arise in the future. I mean, you spoke about the tools that science has given us, and I wanted to sort of quickly touch upon the kind of obsession that we have today in the public discourse, but also in the media, around a cure. And the solidarity trial, which has been extensively talked about. We know that there have been different kinds of narratives, from HCQ to remdesivir and the numerous other ARVs that were brought into the trial. Um, and if you can explain a little bit about that, because in a sense, solidarity told us what doesn't work, but we're still some time away from what possibly works or mitigates the impact of this virus.
I think what everyone is looking for is a magic bullet.
Yeah.
You take one drug, you're cured, or it prevents infection, and you'll be fine. But most diseases actually don't work like that, not even infectious diseases. If we look at viruses, viruses are much more of a challenge than bacteria. And why is that? That's because most bacteria are outside cells. So whatever you apply that can kill the bacteria, break them down, stop them from multiplying, will get rid of the bacteria. Once the bacteria become intracellular, it becomes much harder. Now, viruses, by definition, have to get inside cells to be able to multiply, which means when you develop an antiviral drug, it has to attack a process of the virus and not damage the cells of the human. So developing antivirals is very challenging. And it really is because we had a huge investment in making antivirals for HIV that we have the range that we have today. When you look at what Solidarity was trying to do, Solidarity, Discovery, Recovery, all the large trials that have happened so far, all of them were trying either drugs that existed before as licensed products or as unlicensed products. So these were existing antiretrovirals like lopinavir, ritonavir. Remdesivir was actually developed as a drug for Ebola, found it didn't work, and then tried it on MERS, and on MERS it seemed to show some effect in cell culture systems and then in animals. So it was then repurposed for trying out for this. Now, when we do trials, the idea, it's always useful to take something that is off the shelf and try and use it to see whether it works in people, because developing a new drug takes time. So for us, having an answer on what does not work is really valuable, because you're not going to waste time with that. If you don't do the kinds of studies that you've had with Solidarity and Recovery, what will you wind up with? You will wind up with a situation where every Dr. Tom, Dr. Dick, Dr. Harry will try their favorite medicine, and you won't know whether it works or not. Sure, a patient or 2 or 10 or 20 or 100 might get better with whatever drug they try, but they might have gotten better anyway. We know that in over 80% of people who are infected, they are not going to progress to severe disease. You could easily ascribe that to any treatment you tried out. This is why doing controlled studies, randomized controlled trials that remove elements of bias is absolutely critical in generating evidence about what works and what doesn't work. There is a lot of discussion right now about shall we throw away remdesivir because Solidarity showed that it did not work in terms of preventing mortality. That is countered by the fact that the FDA has just licensed remdesivir, and they had a study showing that it shortened the duration of hospitalization by 5 days. I think it's very important for people to understand that in a trial, you have an outcome that is defined at the start. So when a trial fails to show an effect, it fails to show an effect for what the trial was designed to test for, not for everything that that drug could do. So the fact that remdesivir does not prevent mortality does not mean that remdesivir does not prevent viral replication that remdesivir will not work earlier in illness, but these need to be evaluated. Same thing happened with hydroxychloroquine, where it was used as a prophylactic without evidence, and the trials that were done initially for hydroxychloroquine were not for prophylaxis, they were for treatment. We showed that it didn't work for treatment, and only later did we get the evidence that it also did not work for prophylaxis. So while we wait for something that works, it's good to know what doesn't.
And that's also an important note. I'm just going to remind our viewers that we are taking live questions, so you can ask us questions on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and we will try and have them addressed as much as we can by Dr. Kang, time permitting. You spoke about what doesn't work, and we've seen one issue very briefly that I wanted you to give your opinion on is plasma therapy. Few months ago, I interviewed one of leading COVID doctors who's working in a COVID ward at Medanta, and she very unequivocally said, "We have no reason to believe that plasma therapy works, and we are certainly not going to recommend it." But it was in India. We were running plasma banks for some time now, and what is your view on that? And do you think that's good science?
I think for plasma therapy, again, we need to evaluate plasma therapy rigorously. And what that means is that you're using plasma therapy because you think that antibodies in the plasma from recovered patients will prevent progression of disease in somebody who is currently infected. This is a way of providing treatment, or almost like passive immunization, indirectly. But was the plasma the right plasma? Did it have high levels of neutralizing antibodies? Was it tested for that? Well, quite frankly, much of the plasma that we've been seeing is that if you have plasma that has come from people for whom you don't know the level of binding antibodies, let alone the level of neutralizing antibodies, you don't know whether you're really using the right product for the right condition. So the ideal trial would be one where you measure binding antibodies, measure neutralizing antibodies, and then give the plasma with high levels of neutralizing antibodies to people at a defined time in their illness, and then examine for outcomes. As a control, you could do low titered antibodies, you could do standard of care, which is what we are doing now. But I think with any intervention, it needs rigorous evaluation. With the Placid trial, we didn't have that level of rigor. Still useful, still telling us that this is not the ideal way to go, to set up a trial where you don't characterize what you're giving to people, but it would have been better if we had had antibody levels.
That's very helpful to clarify the plasma therapy issue. I also want to ask you about another issue which is constantly in the news, and I cannot think of a better person than you to answer this, because you understand vaccines better than most people. And there is so much talk and so much public fixation and even political fixation on the vaccine. It's now being used as an electoral issue as well, I'm told. Uh, and one wonders, when did the public good become an electoral promise? But keeping that aside, uh, how do you understand the current time frame for a vaccine? And what, according to you, are the promising candidates? I know you want to talk a little bit about the word promising as well. And what do you think about the current COVID vaccine situation globally? And perhaps we can then talk about in India as well.
So don't get me wrong, I love vaccines. I'm a proponent for vaccines, as most people know. But I think the way vaccines are being projected right now like, it's going to be a switch that goes off. Today we have a vaccine, tomorrow life is back to normal. That is not going to happen. If we look at what is expected of vaccines, we're expecting vaccines to prevent somewhere between 50 and 70% of disease, which means that you're not preventing infection, you're preventing disease, and even that, not in everybody who gets vaccinated. So between half and one third of people who get the vaccine may not actually be protected from disease, which means life is not going to change the minute vaccines come in. But as we vaccinate more and more people with a vaccine that has 50 to 70% efficacy, we will start to see decreases in disease and in transmission. So if we look at what the most promising candidates are, well, every candidate is promising until you get the results of the phase 3 trial that tells you whether it's worked or not. Phase 3 is where you evaluate a vaccine to see did it prevent disease in people who were vaccinated by comparing them to a group of people who did not receive the vaccine and therefore had the normal levels of infection for that community. And if we look at phase 3, there are a dozen vaccines that are already in phase 3 trials around the world. The first readouts may be coming anytime now. I'm expecting that at least 3 of the vaccines will give us interim results by the end of the year. Interim results means that they have pre-specified that if they get a certain number of cases, they will look to see whether the prospects of this vaccine are looking good or not. And if they do look good, then I anticipate that the companies that have those vaccines will be applying to their regulatory authorities for emergency use authorization so that they can start to give the vaccines to more and more people outside of the trial. When we look at the Indian vaccines, the Bharat vaccine is going to go into phase 3 trials. The AstraZeneca vaccine, which is with Serum Institute, is already in phase 3 trials in other parts of the world, and we will have readouts from that probably by the end of this year, which means that even though we've done much smaller studies in India, it's possible that Serum Institute may be able to get their vaccine into the market really quickly. With the other vaccines that are being made in India, where the phase 3s have to be done in India. So that means Covaxin, that means Zycov-D, that means the Gamaleya vaccine with Dr. Reddy's laboratories. All of them will need to recruit their participants, and the size of the trials will be something like what Bharat is doing, which is 28,500. So in the tens of thousands of people for a proper phase 3 trial. You have to recruit them, you have to follow them up for long enough to get cases. So in that sense, I think Serum has a head start because their phase 3 is already being done outside of the country. But having a head start doesn't necessarily mean that this will be the only vaccine there is, even if it is successful. There are so many platforms out there, because there is a limitation on the number of doses that any one manufacturer can make. Even if the first vaccines are successful, we will continue to look for other vaccines to go forward as well.
I did want to ask you this question about, because you mentioned vaccines and we are halfway through the mark of our discussion, and I have a ton of questions that have come up to us on Facebook and other platforms. But before I take them, I do want to ask you this question about equity and access, because this is possibly one of the larger epidemics. And because it is so, I mean, the WHO also called it an infodemic, and saying that there is so much information out there. And this has been the number one trending thing on everything except the elections and some high visibility news. What about equity? How do the most vulnerable and also the poorest people get it? Um, there is already an accelerator which has been started, which is looking at issues like this. But what is your view? How should we ensure access and equity across the world?
Okay, so to start with, I actually chair a committee which is called the Equitable Access Committee for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And we started to discuss the question of equitable access when CEPI was established, because the purpose for establishing CEPI was to make sure that when there was an outbreak, people got the vaccines without needing to worry about the cost of the vaccine or who made the vaccine. Now, that was set up for epidemics. And in epidemics, you have a limited size. You need tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of doses. Now, we are not in an epidemic, we're in a pandemic where everybody wants the vaccine. The last pandemic that we had, which was H1N1, there were vaccines made, and it was very interesting that vaccine nationalism came into play. Every country that made vaccine did not share the vaccine with anyone else. WHO set up a mechanism to distribute vaccines to poorer countries, but the companies provided the vaccines late, and they provided very limited doses of the vaccine, so it was practically useless by that time. So this time, the intention of the ACT accelerator, the Access to COVID-19 Tools accelerator, and the COVAX facility is to make sure that we don't repeat those mistakes. WHO has established the fair allocation principles, and WHO has a working group that has looked at a prioritization framework which has developed the principles by which countries should decide how vaccines should be allocated. The first principle is reciprocity. So people who are putting themselves most at risk to treat infections, to manage patients, treat infections, should be the ones who are protected first. So that obviously means healthcare workers. And of course, there are complexities in that. If you have limited doses, who's a frontline health worker and who is somebody, a professor who sits in the office does not need the vaccine like an intern does. The second is to look at people who have higher risk, and that is really the elderly and people with comorbidities. So through the COVAX facility, which is seeking to provide vaccines to 92 countries that were originally included in the Gavi Alliance, and these are the poorest countries in the world. India is among them, having formerly been eligible for Gavi funding. The idea here is that the COVAX facility will get, and we are pretty close to the target, get 2 billion doses of vaccine, and then make sure that they are distributed around the world. This is stratified. First, it will be 3% of the population of every participating country in the COVAX facility, and then an additional 17%. So 20% of the world's population, especially for low and middle income countries, are promised vaccine through the COVAX facility. The idea is exactly what you said. The poorest and the most vulnerable should be given access to vaccines without needing to worry about how much a vaccine costs.
This is very helpful again, because I think there are continuing concerns about access all across the world, and a body of that nature would certainly help. I'm going to start asking you a few questions because we've just so many. Anasuya Basu is asking a question which is I think, on everybody's mind, and it's also in the news, which is that it's been said that India is probably past its peak, and by February the pandemic might scale. I'm sorry, might scale down quite considerably. What do you think, Dr. Kang? I'm sorry for laughing, but Dr. Kang, I'll just leave it to you to explain this.
Okay, so I think the one thing that all of us have recognized is that this is not, India as a whole is not one epidemic curve. We are made up of multiple small epidemics that need to be put together. We saw that disease was first in Mumbai, then the numbers were high in Delhi, then Indore, Ahmedabad, the cities. Now we are talking about rural areas. So India being past its peak still means that in some places we are heading downwards, in other places we are still climbing. The other things that we have learned is that a lot of this is depending on our behavior. What is it that we are doing to protect ourselves, to protect our populations? It is a question of local action determining what happens to control of transmission. So it's very difficult to say past our peak because, quite frankly, we don't have numbers with the kind of granularity that would be helpful to us to say this. It's very likely there's been a trend that has been going in that direction. Will it be maintained? I don't know. If we look at the US, and again, the US, we have the same issue as in India, where New York was different from rural areas, and now North Dakota has the highest death rates. The US is heading currently into what looks like its third peak. So will we be more like the US than like some other places that have had a single peak and managed to control their disease? Very, very hard to say. But I think it's saying by February is a tad optimistic.
I think, thank you for saying that, because I think that's what a lot of public narratives are trying to project, and I think it's important to be realistic. We have another question from Tanveer Ahmed, and I think this is really looking at post-infection and understanding the progression of the disease in the body to some extent, because I think a lot of people are looking at issues like this, where he's asking, can you say something about post-COVID fever, fatigue, tremors, loss of appetite, how long it will last? Because now increasingly, I work with communities of patients, and we found that a lot of patients, even after 2 months of having the initial infection, are reporting long-term symptoms and problems. Although earlier we were told that you go through the infection cycle and you're cured, which is clearly not the case. What is your as a scientist, what is your view on this?
So having a post-viral syndrome is not restricted to SARS-CoV-2. Anybody who's had chikungunya, or many people who've had chikungunya, will tell you that for a year afterwards you can have arthritis. There are many other viruses that lead to what feels like a chronic fatigue syndrome. It's now called encephalomyalgia. Now, with COVID, this is a disease that is in its early stages. The fact that there is what is called a post-COVID syndrome or a long COVID syndrome does not mean that the virus is sitting around. We have no evidence yet of latency. It may happen, we haven't found it yet. But even without a virus becoming latent, the inflammatory response that is set up during the acute infection can persist for a very long time. How long? We don't know. It's been 4 months for many people that this has persisted. The only good thing that we can say is that for people who have been tracked over time, they do see a gradual improvement in their symptoms. So it is devastating. It can be very, very challenging. People can accuse you of malingering, but it is not. It is something that is very real. And we should be supportive and try to gather as much data as we can so we can understand the extent of the problem.
Another key question that has come up, which being asked Karishma Karan, which is really talking about, she's touching upon therapeutics and vaccines, and she's talking about what is your view on the testing landscape in India? GUI has scaled up testing capacity. How can we do better? What is your view on antigen tests versus PCR tests? this is uh, this is another tricky one, but I'm leaving you to answer that.
Sure. No test is perfect. Okay, so RT-PCR is not perfect, and the rapid antigen test is not perfect, and the new Feluda test will not be perfect. Antibody tests aren't perfect. So when we use a diagnostic test, very important to know why we are using the test and understand the performance of the test and how we use it to inform our further action. So if you have a patient who looks like COVID, walks like COVID, somebody who comes in with a fever, cough, has recent loss of smell, loss of taste, and the RT-PCR is negative, what you're going to do? You're still going to think that, if I hear hoofbeats, it's a horse and not a zebra. So it's a lot of what you do is informed by the whole picture, not the test. Now, having said that, where is an RT-PCR useful? An RT-PCR is a test that gives you quantity, tells you whether how much virus a person is shedding. Is this helpful? Yes, because if your RT-PCR cycles are low, that means that you have a lot of virus and are likely to be transmitting. And if it's high, then it's very unlikely. It's useful in a hospital setting. It's useful to track patients, but it takes time to get those results back. So if it's going to take me 2 days to get the results of an RT-PCR test, and till then I'm not going to be able to isolate a patient or make a decision about a patient, they may be transmitting at that time. In that situation, it may be more value to me to use a rapid antigen test because I'll get a result in 20 minutes. Now, I think with the government, I actually don't know which test is applied to what for what reason. So do you have no antigen tests done in a hospital? Do you have no RT-PCRs done in the community? Who is retested? Who is tested because they are a contact? If we had the reason for testing, which test was used, and the result of those tests, those would actually inform our further actions. Right now, I don't have the data to have an opinion. I can just say one thing. We are testing over 1 million a day, and that's remarkable given where we started off from 6-8 months ago.
You've pointed to some very, very important issues, and I want to touch on them again a little bit, because you were saying how we don't have enough data on what we are applying to how and what that is yielding. And even at the same time, we have made progress with testing. Now, the question, of course, is that part of the response to this pandemic has been led by a lack of enough scientific information, and this is a question I'm asking, not one of the viewers, in the media. There have been cases of misreportage which misinform. There have been cases of stigmatization which have actually created problems for the health workforce. Um, how much more science and public health understanding does the media need? And that's a very specific question because the, the public seems to be trusting the media, and the media is not giving the right information. And this is turning into a fairly confused situation then.
So I think actually for many things, I'm finding that many of the journalists that I speak to are really trying to understand what the situation is. And if you have so many people trying to do that and the public being able to listen to them, certainly the quantity of science journalism has increased. And in some spaces, the quality of the science journalism has increased. Where we wind up with an issue is where inaccurate information is spread far and wide. Some of that is because journalists aren't paying enough attention and are amplifying inaccurate messages. That's not true just of India, that's true all over the world. Whether it is a question of conspiracy theories or irrational treatments or stories that lead to stigmatization of individuals because we have the panic and anxiety that you spoke of earlier, all of that is a reaction to the world that we live in today. What appeals to people and what doesn't. I think as scientists, as public health specialists, we have a responsibility to be available and to continue to communicate to counter these messages. This is not a time for staying in our ivory towers. We need a little bit of that, but we also need to make sure that there is credible scientific communication to counter all the wrong information that gets out there.
Thank you so much for saying that. We are in the last 15 minutes, and again we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to club a few of them together because those are very operational questions. Now there is this fatigue growing in the population in India, but elsewhere also in the world. People are tired of living with this pandemic in a sense, and there is in some cases there's fatalism. About we'll see what happens, dekha jayega. And then, of course, there is the need. There is the economic need. There is the learning need to go back to school and colleges. There is the need to travel to make money. And organizations are now that we've virtually opened up the country. There are all these pressing concerns. I have a ton of questions which I'm going to club together where people are wondering, how do we address life now that the country is open, in a sense? What precautions do I take if I travel? Do I go back to university? There are anxious parents who've written in saying, what happens to learning in this time? And what would you say to them? What would you say about going back to life and with the growing fatigue that we are in?
I think having a choice is a luxury. So if we look at who is most protected by lockdowns and social distancing, it's the people who can afford to work from home. There are many people who cannot do that. And what becomes our responsibility then as citizens of this country? I think there is no activity that is 100% safe. Every activity carries some level of risk of infection. And there is also a benefit that accrues from that activity, whether that is going to school or going to college, and whether it's going to work, using public transport, traveling by air. All of them have some risk, and you will only do that activity if it has some benefit. How much does it matter to me to see my mother? Am I willing to take a flight to do that? I think these are calculations that we need to do for ourselves. But the one thing that is important is to understand that actually prevention is relatively simple ways of functioning. We are all aware of them. We all know what needs to be done. And if we think about it, there is some degree of control that we exercise over our actions and the situations that we are in. So, what is it that you can do to deal with your child's school? What are the actions that the school is taking as regards ventilation, as regards the number of children who are in the classroom, the distance at which the children sit, what kinds of playground activities are permitted? All of these are things that we can influence, and we should look at it from a scientific perspective. What is it that we do to reduce risk of transmission? The important thing is you cannot reduce risk 100%, but you can reduce it very, very significantly for prolonged periods of time. So we have control and we should exercise that.
Another important question that has come, but actually a question that even I wanted to ask by Prapti Jaiswal is, what changes do you think the Indian health system should see post-pandemic? But it's really a broad question, right? Because what changes should the world's health system see? Because we realize that some of the more economically developed and technologically advanced, um, ostensibly high quality care providing countries are unable to cope with this pandemic. And so, what are the key elements that need to change in our health system, first in India, but also globally?
So maybe I'll be radical about this and I'll say I don't want to change anything about our tertiary healthcare system. I don't want to improve quality of care in the ICUs. I don't, we have good doctors, we have good systems. So what change do I want to see? I want to see a strong and resilient primary healthcare system, one that people trust, one that people go to. What will it take for us to build a government run, owned, provided primary healthcare system to which you and I will go? Once we have that, we're done. You
I
need
want
a
to add.
system. You need a system
Please
you
go
can
ahead.
trust. So if we
Yeah, please go
use
ahead,
it,
sorry.
we obviously trust it. And then when the next pandemic comes, the messaging, the tools that are available in terms of surveillance, in terms of advice, in terms of treatments, this will be something that we will all benefit from. I don't think the benefits should accrue to only, English speaking wealthy people. I think it should be the same for all of us.
Thank you so much. I'm going to also add to it and say that I wonder when health will become a political subject where people will vote on the basis of who provides the best healthcare or who promises to provide the best healthcare instead of just bridges and roads. Those are essential too, but so is health. We are in the last 5 minutes, and I have two very interesting questions that I do want to ask you. So, one is, of course, about suddenly science has become our best friend. But when we need to invest in science, when we need to invest in research, and I'm not just talking about India right now, we are constantly shortchanging our academic institutions, our researchers. Um, do you think that should change? And how do you think that should change post this pandemic or even during this pandemic? We've suddenly seen an upsurge of funding for COVID across the world. But this wasn't the scenario when we were pre-pandemic, was it?
It's being called the COVIDization of research. There's no money for anything else. And that's a worry. So I think discovery science is something that we need to invest in, and only governments can invest in discovery science because the solutions and tools of tomorrow will come from that discovery science. When we think about application, that is where partnerships with industry and investment in R&D that can be joint investment can be done. For India and the world, I think there is a distinction in India because we don't invest enough in clinical research, we don't invest in long term projects, and we don't invest on scale. So, if we were to look at ramping up quality clinical research in the country, that would allow us to evaluate drugs, vaccines, devices in actual human beings, that would be valuable. Right now, we still depend on the West to do those evaluations and then transfer what they have found to us. The second thing is, if you have a 3-year project, you're not going to do serious science because you'll be thinking about your next 3-year project while you're doing this one. So you really need to have places that can do serious long-term projects that are not dependent on short grant cycles. Third, I think you need to think of working as teams, which again, we don't do enough.
A last question that has come to us is from a gentleman called Zubair Ahmed, who's asking us, is it wise for the state to reduce testing if the deaths are low? I think it's a kind of ethical dilemma that is being posed here. Was it ever wise for the state to reduce testing, whether the deaths are high or low? So what would be your view briefly on that?
So I think these are the kinds of situations for which our decisions should be informed by modeling exercises. Infectious disease modeling is an incredibly useful tool that we don't use enough of. What you will look for is what is the impact of testing less? What kinds of situations might I miss if I decrease the amount of testing? But when you do modeling, all modeling has to be informed by prior data. And then you see whether the model's predictions hold or not. If you operate in a data-free zone, then the results that you have can go in any direction and you'll never be wrong because, you started with any assumption that you could make.
Let me ask you the last question, which is in a sense science question as well, but also a broader social and economic question, where we are talking about vaccines, we're talking about cures, we're talking about hospital beds and ventilators and the number of tests. We aren't talking enough about basic nutrition. We aren't talking enough about food security, and we're not talking enough about the economic devastation that is unfolding right now and will follow post this pandemic in a country like India. This is, as many economists have warned us, the beginning of of a nutritional crisis, of population health crisis. What is your view on that? How much should we be focused on that, and what would you suggest?
So I don't know if you know that I work on diarrhea and nutrition.
I do.
So chronic stunting is a problem we've had before, and sadly for India, the levels of stunting that we have in children, even though that it has been a downward trajectory, it's been very, very slow to improve. And if we see kids taking a hit, and it's likely that we will, then that has impact not just this year, next year, but for their entire lives, because it affects not only physical development, but cognitive development, and therefore academic and economic achievements. So everything that we can do to ensure that we protect nutrition for the vulnerable, make sure that they stay healthy, is an investment in our future.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us and spending a whole hour with us. We still have a few questions, but we've completely run out of time. And I'm sorry, we'll try and answer those questions the best we can on our Facebook page. Thank you so much, Dr. Kang, for making time today. And thank you. We really enjoyed this discussion, and I hope you did too.
I did, and thanks a lot.
Thank you. And we'll